Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Making Sense of Battle, Journalism and Photography of the Civil War, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. Before we get underway, let me take a minute or two to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Let me see if I can explain what all that means to you. First of all, we're independent. That means we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we sponsor here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write books on topics within the humanities. Subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978, and since then about 1,300 scholars have conducted research here, and as a result of that effort, about 1,300 books have been published. Now, the place may sound like an ivory tower, and from this picture you can see that it looks like an ivory tower, but the founders did not want it to be an ivory tower. And we were particularly interested in connecting with a wide array of audiences beyond the higher educational world. And we were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that through a wide-ranging program of teacher professional development. You can learn about that by going to our America in Class website, which you'll find at americainclass.org. And there you'll find all of the programs that we do, and you'll be able to access them from that website. Now, when you go to that website, if you click on that little icon that I have framed in red there up on the right-hand corner of your screen, that will take you to this page. And from this page, you can order one of our magnificent posters. It's that image you see there, which we call Picturing Monopoly. That is an image of a political cartoon called The Curse of California, which appeared in a publication called The Wasp back on August 19, 1882. It is a wonderful teaching tool when you teach monopoly and monopolistic business practices in the late 19th and early 20th century. It is carefully annotated and is a wonderful teaching tool. In addition, on the back side of that poster, you'll find all sorts of information about the programs that we offer here at the Humanities Center through America in Class. So please let us know you'd like a poster. We'd be happy to send you one. Our posters are free. Now, when our seminar is over, we urge you to go back to the Making Sense of Battle website from which you obtained the readings for this evening's seminar. And there you will find an evaluation. We ask you to please complete that evaluation. You can do it online and submit it to us. It's very important to us. We pay attention to what you tell us. In addition, you'll find a recording of the seminar along with the PowerPoint, and we hope that you'll plunder the PowerPoint for use in your classes. That's what it's there for. We hope you will bring material and ideas from our seminars back to your classes to use with your students. Now, once we've received your evaluation, we'll send you a letter that you'll be able to submit to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, you can participate through chat, and you can put your cursor down in that little green box that you see down at the bottom of the screen there. Type your message in that box, hit the send button to the right, and your message will appear in the larger text box above. I will be bringing in the chat as we go through this evening, so please feel free to make comments and pose questions, and we'll introduce them into the discussion as we go along. That discussion will revolve around slides on which we'll be presenting text excerpts and images, and we'll be analyzing them through a series of discussion questions. Are there any questions before we get underway? We're all ready to go. If you're ready to go, send me a smiley face. Let me know that you're out there listening. Sometimes with these seminars, I think I'm talking into a well. There we go. I see some smiley faces coming through. Great. All right. Well, I take that as a sign that we're ready to go and learn about photography and journalism in the Civil War. We had a very good discussion of the topic on the forum. We had a number of really interesting questions. I'd like to bring those into the conversation right now. First of all, many of you asked, how did Americans respond to seeing images of the war on the home front? And that really is going to be one of the central questions of the seminar this evening. Beyond that, you ask, did Civil War photojournalists and illustrators realize they were recording for history? How often did photographers stage their photos? How can we tell when a photo is staged? What were the most common ways photographs were shared with the public? Were Lincoln and his generals concerned about the photographic representations of the war? Were Civil War photographers and illustrators independent, or were they all employed by newspapers? Were Civil War photographers, illustrators, and journalists biased in their coverage of the war? We had a number of questions that related communications technologies of the 19th century and their impact with communications technologies of the 21st and their impact. What are the similarities and differences between the impacts new communications technologies had in the 19th century and those new communications technologies are having in the 21st? What are the similarities and differences between the home front impact made by Civil War photography and that made by TV coverage of Vietnam? And finally, how has the photographic and journalistic presentation of war changed since the 19th century? And we're going to try to respond to all of those questions in the seminar this evening. I don't know if we will indeed get to all of them, but we'll certainly try. And we're going to do that under three large framing questions. How did changes in communication systems in the mid-19th century affect the way people on the home front receive and process information about the Civil War? How does the poetry of the Civil War reflect the journalism and photography that brought the war to the home front? And how did the poetry, journalism, and photography of the war work together to communicate with readers? Now, as we probe those questions, we have a couple of understandings that we hope you'll take away from the seminar and introduce into your classes. The first one has to do with the Civil War itself. The Civil War was the first conflict in which images of mass death reached wide audiences. The mediation and circulation of war information through newly consolidated mass media networks created what observers called war fever, or simply shock, in people on the home front. Non-combatants, particularly in the North, encountered an unprecedented bombardment of information about tragic events at a distance. Crucially, they had to figure out what to think and how to feel about this vivid intrusion of carnage into the daily routines of their lives. Poetry, which circulated alongside journalistic coverage, helped to shape their responses as they confronted such new questions as how are we supposed to feel when masses of strangers fight and die to defend our causes while we are safe at home, and how are we to make sense of such loss? The second understanding has to do more with literary history. U.S. literary history traces a transformation from romance to realism over the course of the 19th century. And the Civil War is considered the event that fueled this transformation. The standard critical line holds that the war rendered portrayals of idealized characters and situations hopelessly outdated. This transformation can be traced by juxtaposing the poetry of the war next to its print and photographic documentation. Reporters, through the use of poetic language, and photographers, through stark and vivid images, strove to capture and make meaningful what they witnessed. Poets absorbed and tried to make sense of what they and other non-combatants saw and read through careful attention to accuracy and fidelity to the truth. And to lead our discussion this evening, we're very pleased to have with us Eliza Richards, who's a professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Eliza was a fellow at the National Humanities Center last year, and she is back again this year working on a book on photography and journalism of the Civil War. And you see that in 2004, she published Gender and the Poetics of Reception in Poe's Circle. So now let me turn the program over to Eliza, make her the presenter here. And Eliza, the program is all yours. Let me also be a good idea if I turned on your microphone too, wouldn't it?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Okay, you're all plugged in, Eliza. It's all yours. Take it away.
Hello. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to speak with you here this evening. So we're talking, your questions were wonderful, and I really enjoyed thinking about them over the course of the day while I was preparing for this presentation this evening. And I'll try to respond to all of them as I go through the presentation today. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what's different about the Civil War and why it had such a strong impact on the way people thought and felt about war. And you really see that in all the materials we're going to cover this evening. Really, the center of the issue has to do with the convergence of a new mass media system and the first modern war, and what is often called the first total war. that involved civilians as well as soldiers, and that created such massive death tolls because of new technologies of warfare. The things that enabled the emergence of a mass media system are bullet pointed in this slide. The steam press allowed for rapid reproduction of newspapers, and that was necessary for people to get information quickly. The railway system was increasingly expensive, especially in the north. It was being destroyed in the south during this time, during the war. But that allowed for rapid and broad dissemination of the news. The telegraph lines could transmit information almost instantaneously across vast distances, and that was a very new thing, starting at about 1848. But it took time for the lines to be built and constructed across the country. And by the time of the Civil War in 1861, there was quite a massive network of telegraph lines. So people were getting news really rapidly, almost immediately, upon events happening for the first time. There were also changes in photography that I'll discuss in more detail that allowed for photographers in camps and on the battlefield to record the first images, some of the very first images of warfare. This combination of changes led to the advent of eyewitness reporting, and for the first time, professional sketch artists and writers, eyewitness reporters, for the very first time, were sent into the field so that they could send images and news back to illustrated weeklies and other newspapers. Here's a poem that captures some of the feeling that people had about news because of these changes. And I'd like to just take a moment to read it, and you can maybe post in chat some of the impressions you have about what the poem is about. In time of war, the extras fall like rain upon a drought, and startled people crowd around the board, whereon the nation's sum of loss or gain and rude and hurried characters is scored. So if you'd like to post on chat what you think the poem is registering in people's sense of what the news is doing in the time.
Any comments on this poem? List of the dead? Yes, indeed. Yeah. Anything else? The board is where news of the day is posted by the newsboys. Okay. Any other comments? Feeling of panic. Okay. Startled people. Okay. People want to see the dead. Feeling of loss. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. All those things are true. The rain upon a drought suggests that people are thirsty for the news, but they needed it to survive. And it's good to draw attention to the idea of the list of the dead. I think you get that from the sum of loss or gain. And it's true that newspapers carried lists of the dead, and people on the home front scoured them to see if their own relatives, sons, husbands, were among the dead listed. So there's a personal aspect of the news that's important to remember.
Yeah, and it also strikes me too the rude and hurried characters. I mean, that suggests a kind of impersonality of this news. This is not somebody coming to you and breaking the news gently to you that someone has died. This is rude and hurried. Yeah.
That's right, and impersonal. They don't know whose feelings they're going to hurt, and there's no direct personal contact. That's right. And that it's hurried. So often mistakes can be made. The news was constantly corrected and not always accurate, and people were aware of that because news was rushed out so quickly and constantly.
Right. Another thing strikes me about this poem, Eliza, it is a poem. It is now a poem self-consciously about the news itself. I mean, I think
that's right. Yeah.
Suggests an awareness that the news itself is news.
That's great, and it's in poetic form. So while we think of poetry and news as very different things, and in the time you see that they come together, many poets were journalists, journalists were poets, and poems were right alongside journalistic reportage in the newspapers. So Harper's Weekly is one of the main national weeklies in the North during the war, and there are poems and newspaper reports about the news in the newspaper. So people are aware that the news is news right now.
Mm-hmm. It is new.
And here's some more examples of this. Walt Whitman was fascinated with the news. He was also fascinated with photography. And here's another eyewitness account, and many people left them, of what it was like to receive the news. And we can think about, it's important to imagine how that's different than we receive the news today. And think about that while I read this passage. This is Whitman in Specimen Days. I had been to the opera. Oh, and he's talking about the news of Fort Sumter, of the first battle of the war. I had been to the opera in 14th Street that night, and after the performance was walking down Broadway toward 12 o'clock, when I heard in the distance the loud cries of the newsboys, who came presently tearing and yelling up the street, rushing from side to side, even more furiously than usual. I bought an extra and crossed to the Metropolitan Hotel, where the great lamps were still brightly blazing, and with a crowd of others who gathered impromptu, read the news, which was evidently authentic. For the benefit of some who had no papers, one of us read the telegram aloud, while all listened silently and intently. No remark was made by any of the crowd, which had increased to 30 or 40, but all stood a moment or two, if I remember, before they dispersed. I can almost see them there now, under the lamps of midnight again. So what does this passage, I can see people are already posting, but what does this passage tell us about the way Civil War news was delivered and received?
Okay, any comments on this? If you wanted to communicate the idea of the news and the intensity with which it was delivered in the 19th century with your students, this would be a great passage to analyze. I'm struck, Eliza, by the fact that it's midnight and there are a lot of people out and they're intensely interested in the news. We have a comment here, the news brings together community. Good point.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah,
and that you see over and over again in the images of people receiving the news and in the accounts of it, that people feel that they're together hearing the news. That's something that's not really, we don't feel that way today, I'm not sure, the same way.
No.
So it's a common experience and a common feeling.
Right, and the newsboys are moving more furiously than usual, so the hustle and bustle of the news is fairly common. 24-hour news cycle of the day, excellent point. People were asking about comparing contemporary news with 19th century, and see here.
That's new. It's not as if people are getting a full report when everything's all over and done with. They're hearing about things in bits and pieces constantly, and that's part of what makes people obsessed with the news, because they know that there's always going to be more news. So that's great.
Right, and we had
the advent of the 24-hour news cycle.
Right, and we have two comments here about the suspicion of its authenticity. How skeptical were people at this time when with this new barrage of news coming their way?
Yeah, that's wonderful to notice. It's so funny that he says that. It was evidently authentic. People always had a kind of a doubt because news was constantly being corrected and rumors were circulated. People were so hungry for the news, and newspapers were so rushed to get out the news that often there were false reports. So people never fully trusted what they heard, and that can create a sense of instability and uncertainty. So that's a great thing to notice.
We have an interesting comment here. Despite shared experience of hearing the news, it doesn't sound from this passage that there was communal mourning. Sounds as though there was more private or internal experience. People dispersed in silence. A good point. What would you make of that? Did it take a little more time? This is Fort Sumter. Did it take a little more time for communal mourning to set in?
That's very interesting. This is at the very beginning of the war, so it may be the matter of what we're going to look at a little more, this question of shock, people having a hard time even processing the information. They need time to think about it. So that's a great idea that goes along with the counterpoint of getting all this information so quickly. People need time to process it. So yeah, I really like that idea. I hadn't thought about it, but it may change over the course of the war, and I would have to think about that before I responded.
Okay, I think we need to make a point of clarification here. A number of people have suggested this is in Washington, D.C., but actually this is in New York, right?
Yes, it's in New York.
Yeah.
You probably, I understand why you might think it's Washington, because Whitman spent a good deal of the wartime in Washington. He went in 1862 to begin caring for the wounded in the Washington hospitals, but this is happening right at the very beginning of the war in 1861 when he's still in New York.
We have a comment here about comparing newspaper reports like this with blogs of today and their trustworthiness. I think probably I think people, since this was so new, people probably were skeptical, just as we're skeptical of blogs these days, I would think.
Well, that's that's quite interesting. I think about that myself when I'm on Facebook or looking at blogs, and you get that and wondering about the same sense of the circulation of information and people reprinting rapidly the news. I think one main difference is the way that everyone is all together. As someone stressed before, there aren't as many small communities. It really is the consolidation of a national print culture right now. That would be one thing that I think might be different, because there's such a desire for everyone to get on the same side of the war and share patriotic feelings about the war, that the people stay on message quite a bit in these illustrated, nationally circulating newspapers.
Right. And here we have a comment about the shock reaction. Shock reaction reminds me of the shock reaction of watching bombing in Iraq and wondering what would happen next. And that's an interesting comparison, because as far as I can remember, the beginning of the Iraq War was the first time we actually broadcast the beginning of the war.
That's right. Yeah. Is that right? That was the first time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I can't. If anyone can think of another instance, let me know. But there it was, live on TV, the beginning of a war. So I think the shock reaction to that would be something akin to what people saw in the 19th century.
Yeah, the firstness of it.
But we move on to this image. This is really great for teaching.
Yeah, we're still on the same topic, and now you have, as we said, the news of the news. You see it again, and a sketch artist, one of the sketch artists that's employed by a newspaper, the New York Illustrated News was one of the big illustrated newspapers, has sketched a bunch of people watching the news. And if we look carefully at the picture and look at all the people gathered together there, we can learn more about what it means to bring a crowd together around the news and what it tells us about the receipt of the news. Maybe you could think about that and post on that topic. What additional information do we have about the way people receive the news that we gather from this image?
Well, we have different classes, genders, races, all sharing, going back to the comments earlier about shared community, shared experience. And the angle of the people looking up, highly regarded, depended on one source. Let's see, right. That's
kind of true, but then notice that one man is carrying a newspaper, and that's kind of interesting too, because it's almost as if his newspaper is already outdated right after he bought it. And you, do you see what I mean? There's a man in the front with a post. It's true that they're all looking at one posting, and it looks like that man in front with you see just his feet, is reading the news the way Whitman noted in the earlier one, because everyone can't read it from a distance. So that's great. So and it's true that there are all races and classes, but note there's really only one black face in the crowd. So it's primarily white, and I think it's almost entirely male, right?
Yeah, that's been noted. Now, what's going on here? This presumably the fellow whose feet we see there is reading from a news board of the sort that Whitman described in that previous quote, right?
Right. That's right. That's the impression that it's interesting because it's sort of a riddle. People are supposed to guess what everyone's staring at, but that is the scenario from an interesting and unique perspective, as someone noticed. Looking upward, someone has crawled into a vault and is looking at the faces from below.
And I think that responds to the question we have here: why is the image captured from underground? And that's because he wanted to show people looking up.
And
and
to
that's a
see their
really good
faces,
angle
a
to
whole
capture that.
range of faces, it's
Right.
almost like taking a photograph, but you wouldn't be able to take a photograph of this immediate response to the war. That's a very photographic interest, capturing the immediacy, but because photography couldn't take, there were such long exposure times with photography, you couldn't actually take a picture of this at the time.
Right.
You'd have to sketch it.
Right. And we could go back to that image from, we have two more questions that
Oh,
people
sure.
would like to respond to. First of all, what is the man standing on? He's standing on a grate, right?
That's right. That's what I think.
Okay. And then a question here about the literacy rate.
Yeah.
How widespread was literacy in America at this time?
Okay, it's very widespread. All foreigners, Europeans traveling in the country always noted their astonishment at how many Americans knew how to read, and that's because of the public library system and the public education system. And Benjamin Franklin is someone to thank for that. But still, it wasn't as I mean, I actually don't know how it compares to today, but I do think that you see that that's part of why one man is reading to others, and probably some people in the crowd cannot read. So they may be in the crowd because they're trying to hear the news from others who can read, and that might be one of the things that are bringing people together, as people mentioned.
Okay, and then one final question. Earlier you mentioned the advent of steam presses. Another thing you need to produce newspapers is paper. Was paper expensive at this time?
Well, that's a really great point, because that was one of the main obstacles facing the South in the time, because their resources, they were dependent on the North for resources, because the industries were located, print and paper industries were located in the North. So the North really starved the South in order to close down their information networks. So the South is a very different story from the North. We don't have we can think about it at the end of class, but we don't have a lot of time to talk about it now.
Okay.
Not enough, unfortunately. Because all those centers of production were located in the North, there wasn't a shortage of paper, though people were protesting the use of cotton rags, of course, because those were, that was a Southern resource, cotton. But there were ways to make paper during the Civil War, and there weren't hardships that way in the North.
Okay, now someone finally noticed that this also is maybe an early instance of product placement, the advertisement about the importer of Irish whiskey.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Very well may be that John, but that's true. It's what's called puffery. John McAuliffe may have offered his basement in order to get a plug-in for his Irish whiskey.
Yeah, and also the artist may have gotten a sip of that Irish whiskey. But let's move on. We've got about an hour left.
Okay. Well, here's now people are interpreting. We've seen these images of the war, and we've interpreted the news and the reception of the news. But intellectuals at the time and social commentators were also very aware that this new impact of mass media and the confluence of the mass media and the war was having a psychological effect on people, and they were trying to analyze it. And that's what Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a doctor and a commentator, a kind of a Renaissance man, was writing about in this article called Bread in the Newspaper, published in the Atlantic Monthly. And I'll read these pieces. You had it in your packet. And he's diagnosing something he calls war fever. When any startling piece of war news comes, it keeps repeating itself in our minds in spite of all we can do. The same trains of thought go tramping round in a circle through the brain, like the supernumeraries that make up the grand army of the stage show. Now, if a thought goes round the brain 1,000 times in a day, it will have worn it as deep a track as one which has passed through it once a week for 20 years. So he's saying your brain gets old prematurely. There are new conditions of existence which make war as it is with us very different from war as it has been. The first and obvious difference consists in the fact that the whole nation is now penetrated by the ramifications of a network of iron nerves which blast sensation and volition backward and forward to and from towns and provinces as if they were organs and limbs of a single living body. The second is the vast system of iron muscles which, as it were, move the limbs of the mighty organism one upon the other. This perpetual intercommunication, joined to the power of instantaneous action, keeps us always alive with excitement. It's not a breathless courier who comes back with a report from an army we have lost sight of for a month, nor a single bulletin which tells us all we are to know for a week of some great engagement, but almost hourly paragraphs laden with truth or falsehood, as the case may be, making us restless always for the last fact or rumor they are telling. So how is Holmes imagining the Union here, and how is he diagnosing the effect of the news on its recipients?
And how does he see the Union? As a human body, precisely, yeah, as a human body.
Yeah, isn't that strange? And almost a superhuman body, right? It's like an enormous Superman body, a mighty organism.
Supernatural. What struck me too here is that the nervous system here, he's now beginning to talk about the nervous system of this body, and if anything, one way to compare our contemporary situation is that the nervous system has become more acute and more ubiquitous. Now, much like the news of 9/11, yeah.
It's true. He's interested in the brain. It's almost like he's interested in something like post-traumatic stress disorder and the effects on the brain of what's happening. It's as if the brain is being wounded the way soldiers' bodies are being wounded in the war. And there's a direct relation because through electrical currents, information is passing from the war front to the home front.
Also, he's referring to the railroad, as a participant said. The vast system of iron muscles.
That's great. Yeah, he's thinking about the way he's actually thinking about wartime circulation of information, not just recipients on the home front, but the way the government is using information to transport troops and to strategically plan for future battles and to mobilize masses of men in a hurry. Yeah, that's great.
Another comment about the overstimulation of information, right or wrong. And I think that, again, he's looking forward. He doesn't know this, of course, but he's looking forward to the 21st century when we are all overstimulated.
Yeah, it's kind of a burnout, and it's doing something to people's attention and their ability to even feel. It's as if they're feeling too much too quickly. Yeah, and there's a kind of exhaustion that he's suggesting, or an overload. Yeah, that's great. Shall I move on now?
Sure, let's move on.
So we've gotten a sense of an overall sense of how the news is impacting people in general and how everybody is aware of this, the news of the war. I thought it might be interesting to look at how one person, one well-known writer, is influenced by journalism and photography, and that's Walt Whitman, who loved to have his picture taken and had many pictures taken, including by Matthew Brady, one of the main war photographers. He was fascinated with Brady's photography. So this is Walt. And he was a journalist before the war, and as someone noted earlier, went to the hospitals in Washington. He originally went to try to find his brother who had been wounded, found his brother, and found that he was not mortally wounded. His brother went back to continue fighting, but he saw thousands and thousands of people in the hospitals and decided that he wanted to stay and care for them. And he cared for them emotionally, not so much physically, sat by their bedsides and did what he could for them. But the whole time he obsessively noted down, like a journalist, everything he saw while he was watching it, because he thought it was so crucial to record this moment in history and the suffering of individual men. So this is, on the left, you have a picture of the kind of notebook he carried around with him in the hospitals. That's an actual notebook. I believe that was also at the Library of Congress. Someone noted the photographs that are in holdings at Library of Congress. But you can also look at Walt Whitman's hospital notebooks at the Library of Congress online. And here's what he has to say about his hospital notebooks. I carried sometimes half a dozen such books in my pocket at one time. Never was without one of them. I took notes as I went along, often as I sat writing while the other fellow told his story. I would work in this way when I was out in the crowds, then put the stuff together at home. Drum taps was all written in that manner, all of it, all put together by fits and starts on the fields and the hospitals as I worked with the soldier boys. And Drum Taps is the name of the book of poems that he published in 1865, right at the very end of the war.
So this really is the poet as journalist.
Poet as journalist, yes, and he has a variety of ways, and it shows the way people are changing the way they're writing as a direct response to the rise of mass media and the rise of eyewitness reportage. Yeah.
So here we see that transition from romance to realism.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And Whitman is considered by some to be a very early realist. And you can see what makes him a realist is his interest in capturing the moment, not general truths, and offering eyewitness reports of everyday events. Yeah. So here's an example. This is a transcription. I transcribed this from one of his hospital notebooks that's in the Library of Congress. And you can see, so while he didn't fight himself, he thought it was important. It was something that actually wasn't covered in the news, the experience of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died. People were more interested in the generals and what was happening with larger strategic issues, and he felt that the everyman got lost. So he's recording an aspect of the war that isn't covered in the newspapers as much. People noted the lists of the dead. He's trying to supplement the lists of the dead. So here's an example of a story told to him by one unknown Milton Roberts. And so he's transcribing it just from in Milton's words. And Milton must have been, he was in Ward G. After the Battle of White Oaks Church on the retreat, the march at night, the scene between 12 and 2 o'clock that night at the church in the woods, the hospital show at night, the wounded brought in, previous the silent stealth march through the woods, at times stumbling over the bodies of the dead men. There have been terrible fights there that day, only closing at dark. We retreating, the artillery horses, feet muffled orders that men should tread light and only speak in whispers. Then between midnight and 1 o'clock, we halted to rest a couple of hours at an opening in the woods. In this opening was a pretty good-sized old church used impromptu for a hospital for the wounded of the battles of the day thereabout. With these it was filled, all varieties. And here's an actual image, and I transcribed it for you. Horrible behind, this is just a continuation of the description of what Milton saw in this impromptu hospital that was a church. Horrible beyond description, the darkness, lit with candles, lamps, torches, moving about but dark, but plenty of darkness and half darkness. The crowds of wounded, bloody and pale, the surgeons operating, the yards outside also filled. They lay, some on blankets on the ground, some on stray planks. So this jotting of somebody else's experience in Whitman's notebook became one of his most famous poems. From March in the Ranks Hard Pressed and the Road Unknown, where he himself takes on the point of view of the soldier. So on the left you have his hospital notebook, and on the right you have the poem, and I've highlighted the words and descriptions that make their way almost verbatim into his poem. And I'll just read the poem. It's just a selection of the poem. It was in your packet on the right. Then before I depart, I sweep my eyes o'er the scene, fain to absorb it all. Faces, varieties, postures beyond description, most in obscurity, some of them dead. Surgeons operating, attendants holding lights, the smell of ether, the odor of blood. The crowd, oh the crowd of the bloody forms of soldiers. The yard outside also filled, some on the bare ground, some on the planks or stretchers, some in the death spasm, sweating. So the thing to talk about here would be how you think poetry has changed, and why is he relying so heavily on his eyewitness reports, and how is he changing them in his poems?
We have a question here on that topic. Was this research about literature, poetry, or journalism? And it's really about the interplay between poetry and journalism, how the two influenced each other, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think he was a journalist before the war, and we'll see from the next example where he takes things directly from the newspaper, but it shows the way that the relationship between them is very permeable and not separate, I think. So this was research for poetry, primarily, but his poetry was a kind of eyewitness accounting of the war. That's how he thought of it. It was his history of the war.
So we're showing you how journalism, how the facts of the war and the way the war was reported is now seeping into what you might call high culture, how it's changing the way people perceive and actually then feel about these incidents.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
You know, it struck me in the piece that we were reading earlier from Whitman's notebook, with a little tweaking, you've got Hemingway right there.
That's right, yeah. And people go back to Whitman. A lot of writers go back to Whitman, exactly this kind of Whitman, because of his fascination with recording the speech of other people. Yeah, that's great. And this is before tape recorders. So the only way he could do it was through transcription. So, yeah, great.
Well, shall we move ahead then?
Okay, so here's another example of the way Whitman uses journalism, the way journalism makes its way into the poem. Before, he was recording things as if he were a reporter at the bedside of a soldier and turning it into a poem. Here's another one of his famous poems, Cavalry Crossing a Ford. And it's also considered one of his best poems. And we'll see how this came about, what his process was here and how it related to journalism. And I'll just read the poem quickly here. A line in long array where they wind betwixt green islands. They take a serpentine course. Their arms flash in the sun. Hark to the musical clank. Behold the silvery river. In it, the splashing horses, loitering, stop to drink. Behold the brown-faced men. Each group, each person, a picture. The negligent rest on the saddles. Some emerge on the opposite bank. Others are just entering the ford. The Geeden flags flutter gaily in the wind. So one thing you notice about this is, once again, it's kind of snapshot, a picture that a photographer could not take because of the motion. So he's importing technology of photography in order to capture this image. But what's most interesting to me is how closely people have always championed Whitman, his brilliance and his description here, but you'll see that a great deal of it came from a report on the New York Times on August 3rd, 1864. And I give you the comparison here. And I'll just read it on the right, the report in the New York Times, and you can think about what Whitman takes from the article and in what way these images are photographic. The long array of horsemen winding between the green islands and taking a serpentine course across the ford, their arms flashing back the rays of the burning sun. So what do you make of this close relationship between the journalistic eyewitness report and Whitman's poem?
Well, before we get that, I hope everybody will have some comments on that, but we've got some really good comments here. One participant has noted that Whitman's poetry would be a good introduction to the found poem, and I think that's excellent. If you wanted to have students look at journalism and sort of rearrange the words, you could have poetry written right there in your class. And then another really good question.
That's a great idea, yeah.
Yeah. Would Whitman's poetry be considered a primary source about the events of the war, or rather a secondary source, since his information is secondhand? So, Eliza, how would you answer that? I mean, how would you answer that? What is he a primary source for, I suppose, you might say?
Yeah, primary or secondary source. That's
for English teachers, it's primary source. But how might we have a lot of history teachers? How might a history teacher use this?
Well, I know that historians do use it, and it's a problem. They use Whitman's Whitman's poems as if they were eyewitness reports. And also, he wrote prose too, his specimen days and his memoranda of the war. But that's interesting because of what we just saw. That oftentimes things he said he saw himself, he did not see himself. So he brings into his own subjectivity the experiences of others, and oftentimes people mistake it as his own experience. So I think that's an important thing to talk about. So it's for example, I don't believe he ever saw the passing of Abraham Lincoln's funeral, and many historians use him as an example of an eyewitness experience of seeing Lincoln's funeral. Well, that's not true, but what he did do was look at all the photographs of Lincoln's funeral, read the newspaper reports of Lincoln's funeral, and then write essays and poems that seemed as if he were there convincingly, so that people today find them very worthwhile reading. So it's a great question, and it seems to me important to make the distinction between whether he had the experience or whether he was imaginatively performing the experience.
Right. And we have a participant here suggesting that they might be used like oral histories or transcriptions, which I think is a very good way to categorize them.
Yeah, I think that's true, especially if you look, I mean, in the classroom, you could, I think for me, the students love looking at those notebooks and comparing them to his poems and looking at the transformations and thinking about, there are also photographs of the hospitals that you can look at and of the wounded soldiers. So it's important to note that though he didn't fight, he saw thousands and thousands of wounded men and was present during amputations without anesthesia and things like that. So his experience of the war is very valuable, so it's great to think about that, about the relationship between his transcriptions and his poetry that's more crafted.
And we have a really perceptive comment here about the way we look at photographs today. Participant writes, in terms of photographic technology at this point, is there even the concept of a snapshot? In other words, if one must be developing gigantic glass plates and holding still for a minute to take their picture, or maybe my understanding of what we mean by a snapshot here is incorrect. I think that's really a perceptive remark because in the 19th century, there were no snapshots. You didn't just squeeze off the shutter of a camera and make a picture.
That's right.
That's right. It was a far more complicated process.
Yes, and we're about to talk about that. So yeah, that's a great point. And that's part of why you would need to write as if you were a photographer, because photography couldn't yet do it. What I was trying to say is that the idea of capturing a moment in time rather than an idealized portrait of a concept or a romanticized figure, I think goes back to photography, and it influenced the way people were writing. So, but there were many limitations in photography at the time that I'm just about to talk about, so that people writing needed to, they picked the ball up and ran with it as far as what photography could do. And they thought that writing could do some things that photography couldn't. For example, capture a picture in the moment of movement. That's something that photography couldn't do because it was so cumbersome. Yeah.
Okay, so, good point. Shall we move ahead?
Okay, so this is a lot of the questions focused on photography. It seems like a lot of you are really interested in using photographs in the classroom and are fascinated with the history of photography. And I can offer some resources, a short bibliography after the session if you're interested in continuing your research. But just for now, I can tell you a little bit about photography during the war. It was one of the first, but not the first extensively photographed war. The Crimean War was also photographed. But the Crimean War's photographs did not circulate to a wide public the way the photographs of Antietam and other Civil War photographs did. And also, it's interesting to note that in the Crimean War, there were almost no pictures taken of battlefield death. There are only a couple of pictures. It's, for some reason, it didn't occur to the people, or they did not want to take photographs of the dead on the battlefield. So the first time that that was extensively photographed was during the American Civil War. Now, it was the first war open to mass photographic reproduction because of advances in photography. Before the Civil War, you couldn't, before this time period, because ambrotypes and daguerreotypes were just a single image burned onto a plate, a direct positive image. They couldn't be reproduced. The glass plate negative was invented in 1851, and that gave Matthew Brady and other photographers the ability to make multiple copies of photographs so that they could sell them and circulate them more broadly. So that had to be in place before photography could have such a powerful influence. Still, as someone noted, the person talking about snapshots, what it took to take photographs in wartime was a horse-drawn carriage had to be drawn onto the battlefield with big tubs of liquid and glass plates. And because that process was so cumbersome and slow, because it took time for the sun to burn the image into the plates, it was almost impossible to capture motion. You see a few attempts but this early, but not many. So you don't see photographs of battle. What you see are posed portraits of groups of soldiers and important figures like Lincoln and the dead, because the dead are still. So that's why there's the focus on the dead, because wet plate photography was so cumbersome. But the possibility of mass reproduction made people, especially Brady, who was one of the most important corporations, photographic corporations during the war, he recognized the potential for profit because he could reproduce multiple images of the war and sell them through mail catalogs, which he did. So he produced stereo views that people bought and viewed at home, and also album cards, postcards of war scenes. So that's what inspired photographers to go to battle scenes, because of the hope for a profit on the part of the photographic corporations. And then the other thing is that the Battle of Antietam, where it's nicknamed America's Bloodiest Day, that occurred on the 17th of September, 1862. Tens of thousands of people died in a single day. That was the first battlefield dead that were recorded by at Matthew Brady's Corps. The first pictures of battlefield carnage ever to reach a broad public, and it was a huge amount of carnage. So people were already amazed at how many people died in a single day. Over 20,000 people killed and wounded.
Yeah, Eliza, this brings us your comments there bring us to a point that was raised in the forum questions. Participant asked, did these photojournalists realize they were recording history? Let's deconstruct that first of all and ask, were they photojournalists in the sense that we understand that term today?
No, the idea of the photojournalists was in two different, it was kind of split in half in one way. The sketch artists were more like photojournalists. They were employed by illustrated weeklies, along with eyewitness reporters who wrote accounts to sketch events on the battlefields and throughout the war, various kinds of events throughout the war. So those are more like the photojournalists of today. The photographers were usually employed by a company, a for-profit company. So Brady and Gardner and other photographers of the war did recognize that they were photographing something unprecedented, and they wanted those images safeguarded after the war. So they did realize, the same way Whitman did, that they were recording something that was extremely important, but that wasn't really their goal. Their goal was they were employed. Make money. Right.
Okay. All right. Well, shall we move on then?
Yes. So this is an image by Walt, who was also, he was commissioned during the Civil War to create the mural in the new Capitol building in Washington. This is a historical image that he painted of Washington crossing the Delaware. And it's just to give you a point of contrast of how war was portrayed before photography. So think about the difference and what difference that must have made for people when they saw the first photographic images, and what it means to depict war and what it means to depict a battlefield. So maybe you can hold that in your mind as we now switch to look at some of those photographs of the war that Brady's Corps took, the photograph of Antietam. So what do you think about the difference in portrayal? It's just 10 years difference between the Revolutionary War depiction of Washington crossing the Delaware and these new pictures of the battlefield dead at Antietam.
We have one comment already, romanticism versus reality, going back to one of our themes here. Victory versus failure. The Lutzy painting is idealized and romanticized, glamorous as opposed to devastation. No glory in the photos. Washington's painting is idealized. Yeah, different medium, different focus. Yeah, this is, I think this speaks to our understanding about the switch, the movement, the transformation from romanticism to realism.
Yes, so you can see that very starkly in this image. See the United States, it's very composed. There probably never was an image like this, and no one worried whether or not they saw Washington crossing the Delaware. It's more important as an idea that he's standing in the boat and everybody's working hard to transport the great hero forward, and the flag is flying and dawn seems to be breaking or something like that. Yeah, that's great. And yet here, well, the image of the heroic individual has disappeared, right? And maybe it's in part because it's the Confederate dead, photographed by a Union photographer, but it's quite different. And they're part of the landscape, notice. They actually kind of form a V with the landscape, the dead bodies do. They don't stand out from the landscape.
Right. Well, this brings us to two of the questions from the form, Eliza. How often did photographers stage their photos? Okay,
that's an excellent question to raise right now. And I could tell from some of your comments in the forum that some of you have read about this topic. The main work on the topic is by someone named William Fratinito, who's a photographic historian who's written extensively on the Civil War. And he did a lot of work he has a book called Antietam that you can read. It's a fascinating book. What he did was take these photographs, or copies of the photographs, and go to the original battlefield sites and try to reconstruct where these photos were taken, from what perspective. And in doing so, in restaging the photographs, he realized all kinds of things. Even though they look like they are, and they're cast in the descriptions and the titles as if this was exactly how the photographer found the bodies. He discovered a number of things, that the same bodies were sometimes reposed as Confederate and Union soldiers, that sometimes part of his crew pretended they were dead bodies. Sometimes he would drag a body here or there and restage it to create a more enhanced image of different kinds. There's an example of a rebel sharpshooter whose body was decaying in a hole, unfound, and it turns out that he actually moved the body from one photograph to another, and so it disproves that he discovered the body in that pose. So Gardner and Gibson in particular, in the fields of Antietam, did restage and move around the bodies. Fratinito showed that pretty clearly. But at the same time, as both Holmes and the other reviewers that we're going to look at coming up say, when in their comments on the sun capturing an image, there's something about the photograph that you can't get away from, a trace of the real, right? So
we have another comment about the staging. How can we tell when a photo is staged? Now, you mentioned, was it Franciato, his scholarly work? And we'll give you that reference, by the way, in the form, ladies and gentlemen, so that if you check back in the form after the seminar, we'll have that for you, along with Eliza's bibliography. But when you compare some of the photos closely, as he did, you see how he used different bodies. But if you aren't able to make that comparison,
right,
how might you tell that this photo is staged?
Well, I guess what I would look for, I don't think you can. I don't think you can definitively, and I don't really think it matters, because there are things that you really do see. You can see that bodies are decaying in many of these photographs. They were swollen. The photographers arrived on the scene a day later before the bodies were removed, and the heat was already decaying and swelling the bodies.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the decay. You can see, as some of the people who saw the photographs for the first time and were appalled by them note, you can see frozen looks on people's faces. But in terms of, for example, this line, it says the bodies are gathered for burial. This idea of a line mowed down is, it's almost like a trope. And I think they did that to underscore the vast quantity of people who were killed. So that they were just shot down in lines, and that they fell where they were. And you see that over and over again in the reportage and in the photographs. So maybe they rearranged the bodies to make it more of a line, right? To emphasize a certain point that masses of people died. But I don't think that hurts the point that masses of people died, for example. So it's a good question to raise and to talk about. But I don't think it means that the photographs aren't valid. You know, it's just something to discuss. Why we want the real, and why it bothers us if they were rearranged, and what it means that Gardner and Gibson did rearrange the photographs.
Yeah, I think why it bothers us is because we are brought up on the notion of photojournalism. If a photojournalist rearranged things and then took a picture, we would think he was a fraud. But here, that whole concept of the photojournalist hadn't been developed yet. No,
I don't think people cared or would have been shocked, because if you look at Loitza, look at how much less staged. That's the thing. That's the comparison to make. So maybe bodies were moved, but there's a trace of the real that's undeniable. You know, you can go back to this battle, as Frassinito did, go back to this battlefield today, and locate exactly where this line of bodies were. So.
Okay, well, we got about 30 minutes. Shall we move on then?
Okay. Well, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how these photographs were disseminated, because as we said, it's not as easy as today, where they couldn't appear in the newspaper. There wasn't the technology where newspapers could reproduce photographs. So there was a complicated process of dissemination, and some people drew on that too, asking about the impact of these photographs and whether Lincoln and other people in charge of the war effort were concerned about the images of dead bodies getting out. Well, this will answer this to some degree. Here's an image of Matthew Brady's photographic gallery on January 5th, 1861. That's just a few months before the war broke out. And it's a sketch of a sketch artist has sketched the interior of his photographic studio and sketched the photographs inside his studio. So you see that a lot of middle-class people are looking at, and what are they primarily looking at here a few months before the war? What kind of photographic images? This is the same gallery where the Antietam photographs, the dead of Antietam, were shown in '62. So it's interesting to think about the comparison of what people are looking at here and then what they're going to be looking at just a year later, a year and a half later. Because portraiture was the primary purpose for photography before the war, right? So that's, what do you think about that, the contrast between that and then the images of the dead? And we'll come back to that in a minute. So the images, the Brady images were shown in this gallery, and that's the only way that people could directly see the images unless they ordered them from the mail order catalogs, and that was more expensive. They could order postcards and stereoscopic views of the photographs. But they did, it had a tremendous influence on both the written journalism and the imagistic journalism of the time. And here you see direct woodcut copies of the photographs. These are all photographic images of Brady's. It says from photographs by Mr. Matthew Brady. Now, they weren't by him, they were by Gardner. They're the same Antietam photographs that we saw before. They're photographs to match every single one of these. But they've had to be reproduced in woodcuts in order to be mass produced in the illustrated weeklies. So these are woodcuts of photographs. And here you see the comparison, and you can see once again how realism, the idea of realism came about. Think back to the Loitza image. There's the photographic image on the right, and there's the image that appeared in the newspaper that was created by woodblock artists on the left. And here's another example here. The photographic image is on the right, and the newspaper image is on the left.
We have a really good point here one of our participants, Karen Carroll, has made. She notes that there is a danger in applying our standards to this time. Anachronistic interpretations can be confusing, so it's important to make sure students understand the context of these photos. And that goes back to our discussion earlier about the notion of photojournalism not even existing at this time.
That's right. I think that is very important. It really isn't the way people understood these photographs. It created a massive sense of shock because of how different they were and how much information they were transmitting that people had never seen before. So yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important to think about it in the historical context. And it's hard for us today because we're so saturated with these technologies to put ourselves back in this time period when they were new. But that can be really interesting for us and for our students, I think, to do that. So that's great.
Okay. Well, someone else asked, how did photographers make money? And as you pointed out, these were for sale. People could buy them from the gallery or buy them on mail order.
Right.
So that's how they made their money. Okay, well, let's move on then. We've got about 20 minutes.
Okay. Do we have time to read these?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So here are some impressions. As someone said, it's important to get a sense of how people felt about the photographs in their time. And here you see one of the only reviews of the photographs that appeared in the New York Times, a very important Union journal, on October 20th, 1862. And that's quite quickly after they appeared in the gallery. And here's his review of how people felt when they first saw these very different and very new photographs of the dead at Antietam, the first images of mass death to be presented before a public. The living that throng Broadway, and these are people who are far from the war, right? New York some things happened, some events happened during the war, the New York draft riots, for example, but they didn't see battle. The living that throng Broadway care little, perhaps, for the dead at Antietam, but we fancy that they would jostle less carelessly down the great thoroughfare, saunter less at their ease, where a few dripping bodies, fresh from the field, laid along the pavement. There would be a gathering of the skirts and a careful picking of way. Conversation would be less lively, and the general air of pedestrians more subdued. As it is, the dead of the battlefield come up to us very rarely, even in dreams. We see the list in the morning paper at breakfast, but dismiss its recollection with the coffee. So there's another reference to the list of the dead. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along streets, he has done something very like it. At the door of his gallery hangs a little placard, "The Dead of Antietam." Crowds of people are constantly going up the stairs. Follow them and you will find them bending over photographic views of that fearful battlefield taken immediately after the action. You will see hushed, reverend groups standing around those weird copies of carnage, bending down to look in the pale faces of the dead, chained by the strange spell that dwelt in dead men's eyes. These pictures have a terrible distinctness. By the aid of a magnifying glass, the very features of the flame may be distinguished. We would scarce choose to be in the gallery when one of the women bending over them should recognize a husband, a son, or a brother in the still lifeless lines of bodies that lie ready for the gaping trenches. So if you think about the difference between what it was like to see those images versus what it was like to see these posed portraits of the living, that can help give us a sense of what is the difference in the way people are experiencing these images, what's new about these images, and what's horrifying.
Any comments on this this passage? Seems to me to be useful with your students. Last sentence brings me up short. Yeah, lifeless lines of bodies that lie ready for the gaping trenches. Really reflecting the vividness of that writing, reflects the vividness of the photos. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of writers are working hard to bring home and make sense. All kinds of writers are making sense of how we're supposed to feel about this experience of of anonymity and mass death. Yeah,
We've
and
had
it's especially horrible because people are they're used to burying their dead and honoring the burial of the dead, but to find out that your loved one died because you recognize them in a photograph, that's the big nightmare that he evokes here. Yeah,
we've had a number of comparisons, some discussion about comparing the Civil War photographs with the coverage of Vietnam, and I think it's an apt comparison because the Vietnam War was the first war that was really televised. It was and brought home right at dinner time on the 5:30 or 6:30 news, so we weren't able to dismiss its recollection over our dinner. It really, as this reviewer said, sort of put the bodies right in front of us.
Yes, that's right. Though, and that was a distant war. It's interesting to think that this is a war on American soil and between people who used to be part of the same nation just a year before. So, yes, it can give you a sense of some of the horror of those images being brought home. Yeah.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Okay, and here's Holmes. We saw Holmes earlier and read in the newspaper. This is interesting because he's describing what it's like. He ordered them through the mail catalog, the photographs, and he's doing a review generally of photography and doings of a sunbeam and describing what it's like to look at these images at home in his study. Let him who wishes to know what war is look at the series of illustrations. These wrecks of manhood thrown together in careless heaps, arranged in ghastly rows for burial, were alive but yesterday. How dear to their little circles, far away, most of them. How little cared for here by the tired party whose office it is to consign them to the earth. An officer may here and there be recognized, but for the rest, if enemies, they will be counted, and that is all. 80 rebels are buried in this hole, was one of the epitaphs we read and recorded. Many people would not look through these series. Many, having seen it and dreamed of its horrors, would lock it up in a secret drawer, that it might not thrill or revolt those whose soul sickens at such sights. It was so nearly like visiting the battlefield to look over these views that all the emotions excited by the actual sight of the stained and sordid scenes strewed with rags and wrecks came back to us, and we buried them in the recesses of our cabinet as we would have buried the mutilated remains of the dead they too vividly represented. So Holmes went to Antietam battlefield because his son was very badly wounded there. So he arrived a few days after the photographers arrived and saw a lot of the same scenes that they saw. What's interesting is actually he didn't see the scenes. He didn't see the bodies. But now it's as if he remembers seeing the bodies now that he sees the photographs. But he's comparing it to actual eyewitnessing. Yeah.
But it strikes me that both Holmes and the New York Times reviewer speak as if the bodies were actually present. I mean, they both make that comparison.
That's right. Yeah. We'll think there was never before. It's the same idea of the instantaneous conveying of words through a telegraph that really blew people's minds at the time because it had never happened before. You could never receive words at a distance instantaneously. And here you're seeing an image, a trace. And because the sun is considered kind of an etcher of truth, it's as if the bodies have been transported somehow. And yet they're not there, and that's the thing that people are trying to come to terms with. The way the photographs are like bodies, but there is no actual corpse there in the room.
These photographs, too, recent scholarship has shown how these photographs also really disturbed people because they showed how burial customs of the 19th century were violated. I'm thinking of
that's right, Drew Gilpin Faust.
And Fanny Noodleman's book about John Brown's body.
Yeah, John Brown's body. That's right. Yeah, and you see, well, yes, you can see in both the Holmes and the previous review, the horror is really that people are going to be buried and no one's going to even know, and that they'll be counted, and that's all. That the bodies will never make their way home to the family. So yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Yeah. Okay. So Since we've been looking at Antietam and we've been thinking about the dissemination of these experiences, I thought I'd just take a look at the way images of Antietam and the journalistic coverage of Antietam made their way into poetry and images. So these are images of Antietam, but they're not photographic images of Antietam. Sketch, because as we said, photographs couldn't capture action. It's interesting to think about how these photographs are different from Loitza and how they've been affected by photography, but how they're different from photography too. So those are the questions. How are these images like photos and how are they unlike photography? How has visual representation changed as a result of the capacity to take photographic images?
Okay. How are these images like photos? How they show movement? There we go. Yeah, they do. The fire, smoke.
Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on that. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Any other comments? The images shown set into the field to send back drawings based upon observation. These images show a sequence of events that seem to be happening all at once. Right, almost like a film strip. Almost.
That's true. It's like simultaneity. That's true. It's just they're showing important aspects of the battle or something. That's right.
We have a really good comment here. The top sketch seems to trying to show several small stories in one large image. Yeah, that's true.
That is great. Yeah, that's great. And you have to figure out what they are. Right. You see someone carrying away bodies. You see horses that are destroyed. You see people advancing. The flag is still flying. That's right. News is being, it looks like news is being conveyed on horseback. Yeah, lots of things are happening. And you can read the images for meaning. That's one difference from the photographs. They can give you story in these pictures more than photographs can.
So these are our real photojournalists of the Civil War, the illustrators.
Yes, they're closer to what we think of as photojournalists, I think. And this is one of the most famous, Alexander Wad, and rightfully so. And a lot of them came to be some of our best known artists, and I'm going to forget the name of the main person right now, but some of the people who we now consider the greatest painters of the 19th century trained as the sketch artists during the Civil War. Winslow Homer. He's the major artist to emerge from the war. He was a sketch artist, the same way Wad was. Yeah.
We have a question for clarification here. What is the tallest item in the bottom image on the right? Looks like a large tent. I think that's actually the covering of a wagon, because to the right there in the bottom you see a wheel. I think that's probably the canvas of a covered wagon.
It looks like an ambulance.
Yeah, an ambulance.
They're loading the guy into the ambulance, maybe, or loading him off the ambulance. It has to do with transporting the wounded. See, the man has only one leg. The other one has been amputated. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Sure. So here I wanted to make the point that in Antietam, in all the images, both the photographs and the journalistic reportage and the poems, the thing that emerges is the idea of the ghastly harvest, because the battle took place September 17th in a cornfield when the corn was ready to be harvested, and the dead men mowed down the corn. So the cornfields were bloody, and people associated the harvest of the corn with the harvest of the 20,000 men, and so that's the image that it gets distilled in all these, in all the writings to come out of this battle. And you see George Smalley. This is one of the most important reports of Antietam. People still refer to it in histories to get a sense of what the battle was like. The field and its ghastly harvest, which the reaper had gathered in those fatal hours, remained finally with us. 4 times it had been lost in one. The dead are strewn so thickly that as you ride over it, you cannot guide your horse's steps too carefully. Pale and bloody faces are everywhere upturned. And then on the right, you have a poem with the same image of the ghastly harvest from right after the battle, October 18th, 1862, a newspaper poem appearing in the illustrated newspaper. The apples are ripe in the orchard. The work of the reaper is done. and the golden woodlands redden in the blood of the dying sun. So it's interesting to think about which passage is more poetic and which passage is more journalistic, how the passages are the same and how they're different. Helps us see something a bit different about journalism in the period, how poetically Smalley writes. It's as if he were writing a kind of poem to bring home the horror of what he sees.
Okay. Any comments about the poems here? Here we have, okay, I think we can move ahead. Smalley's is much more journalistic. They're really descriptive of the time, and even the feeling is more horrible than the sketches. And I think that point about feeling is well made. You want to comment on that in the next
that's great.
slide?
Yeah, that's
the
really
juxtaposition
important
of the poetry and the journalism.
Yes, yes. So I'm not sure the photographs can speak for themselves, and they don't speak for themselves. What you get is a bunch of dead bodies in a lot of them, and that's horrifying. But everybody recognizes that you need, in the time, that you need more than that. You need to come to an understanding of what the images mean, and you need to come to an understanding of what's happening in the war. And that's why I think it's important to look at the poetry and the journalism alongside the photography to get a fuller sense of how people felt and how they responded to this experience. Yeah.
We have a comment here from Ruth Mills that really addresses the whole notion of the context of the poetry. She writes, "If you didn't know After All referred to the battlefield, you might not realize it was about the dead." And of course, this poem, you know, people knew what happened in September of 1862, a month before the poem appeared, and it would appear side by side with the journalistic story.
That's right.
So
that's right.
You want to move on to the next slide and comment about that?
Yes,
that
because that's going on. So here you have a similar image, but the title of this poem, you're absolutely right. It took me a while to realize this. This is actually the research that I'm working on. I have a chapter on Antietam and the way that all these bloody harvest poems came out of the war. So it's true that it's not obvious right off the bat. I've been working on this for a while. But some of the poems are actually called after the Battle of Antietam, and they have a similar image. And this one's really horrifying too. The harvest moon or the battle plain shines dim in the filmy eyes of the dead, and the yellow wealth of the later grain, ground by the millstones of death and pain, and wet with the lifeblood of the slain, is kneaded to horrible bread. So I find this is a very rich image because it absorbs the news reports of the war because the dead were indeed strewn over the corn. And the idea that the blood mixes with the corn to create a kind of bread, it evokes a kind of perverse image of the body and blood of Christ, I think, and raises questions about the legitimacy of the war and whether the sacrifice of human life is worth it. And then also the idea of that the light from the moon shines dim in the filmy eyes of the dead. That's a photographic image. I think that's an echo of the images of the photographs of the Antietam dead. The way the light reflects back from the eyes, a lot of people noted that in seeing the images.
Okay. Shall we move on then?
Okay, and I'm not sure how much time do we have.
We have about 6 minutes. We got plenty of time. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to bring this in. It's one of my hobby horses, Emily Dickinson, and the idea that she's simply an isolated person who had no, people tend to think that she, because she didn't travel a lot, she wasn't tied to her time in any way, and neither was her poetry. But I think that's clearly not true. She, like everybody else, voraciously read newspapers, and you see a lot of the same kinds of images that we've just seen in published newspaper reports and poems, which she would have read. And she actually talks in a number of her letters about what it's like to, how she feels personally, or how personal feeling is changed because of the war. And this is in a letter to the Norcross sisters, her aunts. Sorrow seems more general than it did, and not the estate of few persons since the war began. And if the anguish of others helped one with one's own, now would be many medicines. I noticed that Robert Browning had made another poem, and I was astonished till I remembered that I myself, in my smaller way, sang off charnel steps. Everyday life feels mightier, and what we have the power to be, more stupendous. So what she's saying is that poetry has a place in war, and she feels that her poetry, that's how I interpret what she's saying. She feels she's singing off charnel steps. She feels that her poetry has a place in the expression of the grief that's of the collective brought on by the Civil War, not just her personal grief. And here's an example of her. She tends to write strange versions of what other people write. And here's an example. We looked at In Time of War, which is a popular newspaper poetry, and the beginning, a popular newspaper poem in the beginning of our presentation. The actors fall like rain upon a drought. But Dickinson had a bunch of news poems too about how news feels when you receive it. And this is an example, and it's written during, I think it's 1862. So right around the time of the Battle of Antietam. How news must feel when traveling, if news have any heart. Advancing on the transport, flew little like a shot. So the same kinds of questions about what it's like to receive news, physical violence from a distance, and what physical effect it has on the individual and what emotional effect it has on the individual. She's condensed into this poem. And also the idea, people noted that news has no feelings, that people are reading the lists of the dead, and that's very different from someone informing you personally that a loved one has died. That seems to be what she's meditating on here too. And she's using war images to describe, war metaphors to describe what it's like to receive news, which puts it into the war context. So riddle like a shot.
Yeah, I think the whole poem turns on that verb riddle in the sense of, to baffle somebody, but also to penetrate.
To penetrate multiply, right? To riddle, right?
Yeah. We have an interesting
perforate, right?
Right. We have an interesting comment here from Elizabeth Monroe. It's interesting to compare our talk about reapers with Homer's 1865 painting Veteran in a New Field, in which a former soldier reaps wheat with a single-bladed scythe. If you're unfamiliar with that painting, I urge you all to take a look at it. You can find it in our online toolbox called The Gilded and the Gritty in the section on Civil War memory. But it's a wonderful teaching tool about how people remembered the Civil War.
That's right, and you're right. That's a great image to bring into this question. The harvest image, you're right. It extends beyond Antietam, and Homer does pick it up. But you're absolutely right. You can pick up that image and that metaphor that was very resonant in the time, because people were thinking of these ghastly harvests of young men dying before their time in harvest fields. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay.
And then this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think this is a stretch, but whatever. You can see what you think. I think this is Dickinson's Antietam poem, and you can see what you think because I've given you some of the other poems that are more directly related to Antietam. She didn't publish almost any of her poems during her lifetime. They were published after her death. But it's something to end with, to think about how to put the poetry of Dickinson in the context of the war. The name of it is Autumn. The hue of it is blood. An artery upon the hill, a vein along the road. Great globules in the alleys, and oh, the shower of stain when winds upset the basin and spill the scarlet rain. It sprinkles bonnets far below. It gathers ruddy pools, then eddies like a rose away upon vermilion wheels. And you see that it was composed in the late summer of 1862. So she's a New England poet, and she's writing most directly about the changing of the leaves in autumn time. But it's almost like a hallucination, because everything in the landscape is red, and she's describing it like a huge, bloody, flayed body. It evokes the body in Holmes's, the supernatural body in Holmes's Bread in the Newspaper that we saw earlier. And because autumn is in quotes, and that autumn was nicknamed the Bloody Autumn because of Antietam, I think she's suggesting that autumn is a code word in some way for Antietam. The words sound the same.
Well, you've convinced me, Eliza. I think this is about Antietam. Here we have a question: was her source always from newspaper articles? Did she have any other source of news about the Civil War?
Yes. Well, she was from Amherst, Massachusetts, and some of her, many of her of the villagers died in the Battle of New Bern in North Carolina, actually. And the funerals were held in public processions through the streets, and she knew some of these young men personally. And her mentor, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and I could talk more about that, but they carried on a long exchange. He was the person she wrote to ask if her poetry was alive. He was the commander of the 1st Black Army Regiment in South Carolina, that was stationed in South Carolina. So she had many contacts with the war, none of them direct. Yeah.
We have an interesting comment here. I think the essential question for a lesson on this topic with high school students could be to compare the effect of journalism during the Civil War with contemporary war. Does it have the same effect today? During the Civil War, loved ones would go quite a while without news of the war events or progress, but today news is almost immediate. Does this change the impact of the news? Actually, from what we've seen earlier, in the North at any rate, they did get news rather quickly. So they didn't, in cities at any rate, I suppose. Eliza, how did people in rural areas, did they have long periods when they didn't hear the news? I mean, our images, Whitman is in New York, our image, the illustration, that's New York. This is a good point. Do people outside of the cities get news quickly?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. A lot of those images that you see are people in larger cities or towns, at least, receiving the news via telegraph. So, you know, I haven't read anything on that topic, but I'm sure it's a lot. People emphasize the consolidation of news networks in this period and the immediacy of the transmission of information, but I'm sure it's much more uneven than that. It's just that the consolidation is the new thing historically, but I'm sure, as always, you know, as today many people don't have laptops and unimaginably many people aren't on the internet. I'm sure it's the same. There's the same kind of unevenness in the 19th century. So that's a good point. And there are lots of images of people getting the information of their loved ones dying by letter, which is how Whitman helped many of the soldiers, the wounded soldiers in the hospitals. He wrote letters home to the parents, conveying the news of the wound.
Okay, so, well, we've got to wrap things up. Shall we move on then to our last 2 slides?
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, maybe we can even skip this. What time do we have? Yeah, we're running out of time.
We've gone over time. Nobody seems to be leaving, so if you take a minute to illustrate what you're after here, I think it'll be worthwhile.
Okay, so what I won't read the slides, but what you have on the left are images of poems about autumn from before the war. And it gives you a sense of, there was no blood in the autumn poems before the war. We kept seeing the image of the ghastly harvest, the bloody harvest, in the poems about autumn that I showed you earlier, including Dickinson's that you see on the right. These are precursors. There was a romantic tradition of autumn moon poems. And you see the earlier one from William Wordsworth, To the Moon, where it's completely idyllic and almost like a magical, idealized magical world. And then Longfellow in 1845 as well. It's a religious image. They're both shrines, Christian shrines in some way. So it gives you a sense of the strong contrast. I think it's very helpful for teaching to see what has happened to the idea of autumn because of Antietam and these other huge battles that took place in the September of 1862. So that's what I'm showing you there.
So again, the transformation to from Romanticism to realism.
To a kind of realism, yes.
Okay.
Dickinson's images are hallucinatory, but they are taking into account, it's like she's looking at the autumn leaves and can't think about anything but blood. Yeah.
Right. Just very quickly, go back. If we go back to that image, back to the last slide, the numbers 656J, 465F. Quickly, what do those refer to?
Okay, Dickinson, I showed you in the earlier slide, this is the manuscript of her poem on the left. That's how she left them when she died. And you can see on the bottom of the page, she didn't even resolve a lot of the word choices, and there are a bunch of alternative phrasings on the bottom of the page. And I think these are really interesting to look at. So there are different editions of her poems by different editors, and the J is for the Johnson edition, which is an earlier edition that many people still work from, and then Franklin is a more recent edition, and that's what the F is. So they numbered them differently, and they edited them differently, and it's a question of what they should, how they should look on the page, and even how to read her handwriting, because she never published them herself.
Okay, and then we have a question from the Dickinson poem: are bonnets flowers, hats, etc.? And I think the answer there is, as always with Dickens, they're both. I mean, it sprinkles bonnets, ladies' hats, but the blood also sprinkles the flowers.
Yeah. So the idea, I like the idea of the bonnets being women's hats, because I think she's stressing the difference between being in New England, where the war is not, and people can still walk around in their bonnets, and being in the South, where the land is flowing with blood. And she's suggesting that it's a circulatory system, the same way Holmes did, where nobody's hands are clean, not even the people in the North.
Okay.
I think that's what she's suggesting there.
Well, then let's move on to our final slide.
Okay, so we were just talking about the South. I'm really sorry we didn't have time to talk more about it, but it's such a very different experience that it's hard to compress into a single hour and a half class. So what you see on the right is an image in Frank Leslie's illustrated paper, another one of these images by a sketch artist, showing the Union troops destroying the telegraph lines. So the South was part of a national network before the war, but once they seceded, the Union soldiers worked very hard, understanding how important the transmission of information was for winning the war, for battle time strategy. It shows the importance of information systems. They did whatever they could to destroy the railway lines and the telegraph lines and cut off the South and destroy their information network. So the South was in a very different situation. There was not a consolidation of mass media. In fact, there was the destruction of what information networks they had, and they lacked resources of all kinds. Still, though, they thought it was essential to have newspapers in the news, but they struggled under many physical constraints, including the fact that they were that the war was fought on their home soil. It made it very difficult for them to establish and publish newspapers and magazines in the same way that happened in the North.
Okay, folks, we've come to the end of our seminar. Have we addressed all of your questions? While you're thinking about that, I do have one question to pose. Throughout the discussion this evening, people have asked in one way or another, did the photography and journalism of the Civil War serve a larger political purpose? In other words, did the journalism and photography marshal pro and anti-war sentiments? Eliza, could you comment on that?
Well, especially in the beginning of the war, I think the country was divided, and propaganda was completely tied in to reportage, right? And so Brady and Gardner and most of the photography that's extant, that's in the Library of Congress, is Union photography, and they do show a very definite federal slant. And they often frame the photographs with descriptions that belittle the Confederate soldiers or aggrandize the Northern soldiers. So yeah, propaganda and patriotism was really not separate from news. There was a move towards realism and objectivity, but there was a strong editorial component in photography and journalism and any other representation of the war on both sides, on both the northern and the southern side. It might seem stronger on the southern side because they were working hard to establish a whole new nation, but you see it on both sides. So that's an important question. Objectivity is bound up with other issues in the poetry and the reportage and the photographs of the time.
Okay, and people are asking about the bibliography you mentioned earlier, bibliography of sources,
Yes.
and some of the other works we've mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, if you please check the forum, we will have that material there. I'll post some things tomorrow, Eliza, as soon as you get me the bibliography you'd like posted. We'll put that up on the forum, so please check the forum tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I'll put together a bibliography and I'll post it for you.
Okay, check it. If it's not there tomorrow, it will be there shortly. And use the forum, please, to continue your discussion and to share fresh approaches and discussion questions that work. We'll monitor the forum until December 16th, and if there are any questions or comments that we need to pass on to Eliza, we shall do that. Please don't forget our posters. They are free. We'd love to send you one. And also, don't forget your evaluations. They are very important to us, and as I said earlier, we do pay attention to them. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation
tonight. Thank you all. It was a pleasure. I really appreciated your comments.
And Eliza, thank you. You've given us a great seminar. The comments rolling in now indicate that people learned a great deal. I know I did. So thank you all very much, and I hope you'll be back with us for other seminars. Please check our fall schedule. It's up on our website now. Our spring schedule. It's on our website now. I think you'll see some really interesting topics, and I hope you'll sign up and join us again. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Take care. Have a good evening.
Goodbye.